We're here to talk about what everybody is talking about Stanford Law. Now, a while ago, there was an incident at Yale Law School where a Federalist Society event was interrupted or disrupted or something. And I thought that was an anomaly. I said, top line law school, these kind of cancel culture, deplatforming things going on, that's not supposed to happen at a law school. Now, apparently, with the disruption of the event that the Stanford Federalist sponsored, in which Federal Judge Kyle Duncan was not, in effect, allowed to present his speech, we're back to square one, it seems, on this issue of free speech in law schools. But I don't want to prejudice the conversation, and you guys are firsthand. Now, I take it that you're both members, how they said, openly members of the Federalist Society community at the Stanford Law School. Do I get that right?
Yeah. Yes, we are. Yes.
Okay, so let me just ask David. What happened, David, out there? And can you just give us a reprise on the events?
Yeah, so our society invited Kyle Duncan, a federal judge from the Fifth Circuit, to speak on, I think it was guns in COVID in particular, and social media, I think. And the Fifth Circuit is a particularly interesting circuit. Some call it like one of the most conservative circuits. And I think we all were interested in what he might have to say on those topics. But a few days before the event, I think, these flyers started circulating, to Kyle Duncan, FedSoc, you should be ashamed, including posters that actually revealed the names and faces of our executive board. And they were posted around the courtyard, like around the law school. And basically, it seemed like something was going to happen. And so, Spencer and I have slightly different experiences with the lead up to the event. Spencer went to the event early, although there was a big protest outside the event. They had already lined up. I witnessed some of the protest and walked in with Dean Steinbach. And then the event took place. And essentially what happened at the event was there was about 10 minutes of the judge Tim, our president, giving the speech. And then the judge was beginning to give his prepared remarks. And he was basically heckled at every sentence with a mix of, comments about his, snarky comments about his judgeship, also comments that really didn't have anything to do with his judgeship. And eventually the event devolved into a somewhat heated exchange, I think is a mild way of putting it, between the judge and some of the protesters. I should also mention that the room was packed. The FedSoc members, and also I think members who just in general went to listen to the event, were outnumbered considerably. Many people went peacefully. They just held up signs or they just listened and asked pointed questions in the Q&A. But there were some who heckled and disrupted the event. I think that's a start.
Go ahead, Spencer. You want to add to that?
Yeah, no, David covered, the opening, which, personally, I can speak for myself and say that it was very disappointing to see so many of our classmates, basically trying to shout down a federal judge instead of hearing what he had to say. But that wasn't even the most troubling part of what happened, because that was, like David said, about 10 to 15 minutes in, when it was clear that the judge wasn't going to be able to give his remarks. And at that point, he asked for help from the administrator. And that's when Dean Steinbach, the associate dean at the Law School for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, stepped up to the podium. She took the podium from Judge Duncan, and then she proceeded to agree with the protesters to attack Judge Duncan's record, say that his judgments had landed as a total disenfranchisement of the rights of the people in the room, and that he should be listening and learning from them. And then she asked the now famous question, is the juice worth the squeeze? And she essentially asked, she said, look, in one breath, I believe in freedom of speech, but in the next one, but maybe when speech causes this much division, we have to ask if it's really worth the squeeze. And it was at that moment that I kind of realized, wow, this is going to be a real problem when the person who's been tasked with actually ensuring that we have a space where free speech and discussion can happen is stepping in, not only taking a side, but then basically trying to get the judge to lead. And And so, she spoke for about 6 minutes. She took about 6 minutes of our
Longer.
Event time. Yeah, perhaps longer. And then at that point, the judge, was allowed to take the podium again at his own event that we were sponsoring. And then, about half of the protesters left, but the rest stayed. And then there was a fairly contentious question and answer period. And to David's point, in fairness, there were several of our classmates who were there protesting who I thought, acted well within the boundaries of what's appropriate. They held signs, they asked difficult questions, but there were also a lot of people who I think went well outside the bounds of not just decorum and these, kind of high-minded ideals of politeness and civility, but violated the rules of the actual university's speech code, and who insisted on interrupting, who insisted on shouting over answers that they didn't like. And I think that was really the rest of the event was this kind of shouting match back and forth. Judge Duncan was heated by this point. And so really it just devolved into a shouting match. And in the end, the judge ended the event when it was clear that, there was going to be no more rational discussion that was going to happen.
Let me interrupt just for a minute. I'll just say while I have you here, Spencer, I saw the video of Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Steinbach's response. She had prepared remarks. She was reading prepared remarks, man. That blew my mind. That blew my mind.
The worst part to me was that Judge Duncan, when she comes up, she had not introduced herself to him prior to the event. And she comes up to the podium when he asks for help, and he says, "All right, can we talk?" And she says, "No, I want to talk to the room." And he says, "Why? I want to just talk to a dean." She's like, "Yes, I'm a dean. Let's talk together." And people are yelling, at Judge Duncan, "Let her speak." They already apparently knew she was going to speak. Let her speak. Let her speak. And then at that point, she takes out remarks, and he's like, "Well, really, you going to talk?" And she said, "Yes, just because you asked. I'm going to just answer your question." And then she starts reading from this typed up page of remarks that she had prepared beforehand. So the whole thing, I think, was, the judge's words were, it was a setup. And it sure looked like it.
Is it worth the pain that this causes and the division that it causes? Do you have something so incredible, important to say about Twitter and guns and COVID that is worth this impact on the division of these people who have sat next to each other for years, who are going through what is the battle of law school together so that they can go out into the world and be advocates? And this is the division this caused. When I say, is the juice worth the squeeze, that's what I'm asking. Is this worth it? And I hope so, and I'll stay for your remarks to see, because I do want to know your perspective. And like all guests on our campus, we ask that you come with good intentions and respect. And I do want to hear your remarks, and I do want to say thank you for protecting the free speech that we value here of our speakers and of our protesters. And I want to remind you all of one thing. I chose to be here today. You all chose to be here today. Many people go before Judge Duncan who do not necessarily choose to be there. And they have to listen to everything he says. Literally thousands of people. You have a choice. You do not need to stay here if this is not where you want to be. You can stay here if this is where you want to be right now. But make that choice.
One other thing I want to bring up here, the estimable Judge Kyle Duncan lost his cool a little bit, didn't he?
Yes.
He got pissed off, and he let everybody in the room know that he was pissed off. You think that, with respect to him, was a mistake?
Well, I can speak on this. I have a lot of respect for Judge Duncan, but I'll be frank that I think it would have been better for us if he hadn't, because it would have made the point clearer. But I'll say this. I think multiple things could be true at the same time, which is that when Judge Duncan got angry, that probably wasn't the best reaction. But also he was provoked by blatant violations of the policy that would have allowed him to give his speech. So frankly, I'm not going to judge the judge too harshly. Or as I hope just came across, even the protesters too harshly because they were led astray by someone in a position of authority. The whataboutism has just been astounding. There are entire articles where the headline is, federal judge berates Stanford Law School students, and that's all they talk about. And then there are other articles that say like, protesters yell down the judge, and then other articles that just talk about Dean Steinbach, but very few articles, I think, bring them all together. And I think that's the issue, is that you can acknowledge that all of these things happened. But what makes this different than Yale's issue is that an administrator stepped in, and it was a federal judge. And so I think that's what I think we should be talking about, is the fact that the law school itself stepped in and condoned the heckler's veto. That's what makes this so remarkable. We know that students, unfortunately, will protest and that sometimes they'll cross the line. But what makes this different is that the administrator not only stayed silent, but then got up to encourage it.
I would just add, I agree. I think it's well put. I think it's rich for anybody to sort of, truly put themselves in the situation of the judge and say, oh, I absolutely would have reacted calmly. I would have addressed it perfectly. Like, it was pretty bad. I mean, because, we were in the audience together, Spencer and I, and, so we didn't see the whole thing, but the room was packed. There were signs everywhere. Some of the signs were totally legit, and some of them had, serious vulgarity that I think would have, especially somebody like, I don't know, the Christian faith, or I think it would be upsetting. I don't know. And and the sort of, he could feel, I think I'm quoting Ish, the utter contempt that they had for him. And I think when somebody feels contempt, they either slink away or they fight back. And Judge Duncan chose to fight back. Would I have reacted the same way? Again, I think it would be rich for me to say, oh yeah, absolutely not. Yes, he did punch back. I think it wasn't great for us, but I understand where he's coming from. And I think it is very important to note that he was really egged on. I also think it took, but well, I was going to say, I think it took everybody by surprise a little bit.
I assume this is a family-friendly show, so we can't, really do this. But I think just to give some context of the weight of what was said.
We have used the F word on this show before. Just you don't have to use it, Spencer, but it has been used on this show.
That's comforting. It's a Sunday. I don't know. I'm trying to stay clean here. No, it was remarkable. Just the level, the degree of the vulgarity that was used, right? There was a whole sign and a shouted question about, Judge Duncan's inability to find, a certain female sexual organ, that was, shouted very loudly. There were a lot of discussion. There's a lot of discussion of the judge's, sexual impotence. And then something that Judge Duncan explained in his op-ed, I didn't hear this because I wasn't there when he walked in, but apparently he said that someone yelled at him and said, direct quote, we hope your daughters get raped.
I saw that.
So I think that it's important to understand the level of, it's not even just contempt at that point. The level, of just the invective that's being hurled at him at that moment.
Let me offer this for your consideration. If a comparable event organized on the left were to have taken place, and a first-year law student was photographed in the audience holding up a sign for a gay rights advocate saying, F you, or you're a child molester, or something like that, that person would not be employable in any respectable law firm or, whatever, forever. That would follow them to their grave. It would be like appearing in blackface somewhere. Why not similar career consequences for people who violate norms of decency and respectability, such as what you've just described? I can say as an economist, the incentives induced by such a social practice would keep people from behaving like that.
I think that's exactly right. I think that there should be consequences. I think that there should be a high expectation and not just an expectation, but a high standard of conduct on the part of the university and just the legal profession generally. To even extend, I think you're counterfactual with the if a liberal judge or a gay rights activist came, how inappropriate it would be for us to protest that way and the kind of consequences we would face. If I said some of the things that were said just to a female classmate, that would be sexual harassment, because it was. That's what happened at Stanford Law School. Is a federal judge came and in protest, the students sexually harassed him by shouting sexual vulgarities at him about him, his wife, and his daughters.